What's going on, guys? Welcome back, and today I'm going to be bringing you another book review or kind of overview, and today I'm going to be giving my thoughts on the Thrawn Trilogy, or the Canon Thrawn Trilogy by Timothy Zahn. Now, these books consist of Thrawn from 2017, Thrawn Alliances from 2018, and Thrawn Treason from 2019. Now, a couple months ago, I made a review on Thrawn Ascendancy Chaos Rising, which was the first book of Timothy Zahn's new kind of Thrawn prequel series to this series, in a way, although certain elements do intertwine into Thrawn Chaos Rising as seen in Thrawn Alliances, but there's just a lot of interesting stuff in these books, and I really loved these books, actually. I know a lot of people don't like, from what I understand, the common consensus online seems to be that Thrawn from 2017 is great, and that Alliances and Treason aren't as good. Now, when I started Treason, I wasn't as invested as I was in the first two, because there wasn't, that hook. But as Treason went on, I started to become more and more wrapped up in the narrative, and I just find Thrawn to be an extremely investing character. The idea that they start to bring up in Alliances and Treason is the idea that, where do your alliances, or where do your loyalties and your alliances, where do they really lie? Who are you loyal to? Are you loyal to tyranny, or are you loyal to your own people? And where do you cross that line? When do you cross that line into becoming a traitor to a certain group or another? And it kind of shows how Thrawn, in some ways, is almost on equal ground with Palpatine, because in kind of the main Star Wars narrative, Palpatine is kind of the most clever and conniving character we've seen. But throughout these books, you see how Thrawn is kind of able to pull all these right strings to kind of stay in Palpatine's good graces. And in a way, he is being used by Palpatine, but he's kind of aware of that and is always kind of trying to stay on a level playing field, because he knows he can't outplay Palpatine, but he knows that he can at least stay on a level playing field. And that's very interesting about this series, is that Thrawn, he's just a guy. He's a really smart guy, and he's an alien, but he's just a guy. He's not some super special superhero guy, and that's what's really investing about him, is that you're seeing basically just this guy who naturally is extremely smart and tactful, and he's able to stay on a level playing field with people like Emperor Palpatine, and it adds this kind of other layer to his appearances in the shows, because if you remember from my review I did a couple months back on Thrawn Chaos Rising, I felt that his character was inconsistent with Rebels. I felt like in Rebels, Dave Filoni turned his character into more of a clear-cut antagonist and villainous character, but in this series, you see, like I said, kind of the shift in alliances that has to happen, and how he has to kind of explain things to other people to try and come up with valid reasons why he can do certain things, and he gets very close to crossing the line on multiple occasions, and even kind of does cross the line at the end of Thrawn Treason, which results to Palpatine basically threatening him. And then you kind of see how he was driven to do certain things in Rebels, and you get to see the perspective of the Empire, how the Empire doesn't view itself in a bad way. If you think about it, George Lucas did kind of an interesting thing with the original Star Wars films, which was the fact that the protagonists of those films are people in real life that we would view as terrorists, and they are opposing kind of the government in a way. And in this series, you get to see the perspective of the government, of the Empire, the big powerhouse, And you get to see how Thrawn, being this person who's really close or kind of in close contact with the Emperor, how he has this kind of introspection that no one else does into the real corruption of the Empire, and how so many other people view the Empire as a just, source, like, that it is what the galaxy needs. And there's even this really interesting confrontation with the character Night Swan, who's kind of the main protagonist and is the Moriarty to Thrawn's Sherlock Holmes, because I've seen people compare this series, or particularly the first book, to a Sherlock Holmes story, because Thrawn and Eli Vanto are kind of these Sherlock and Watson type characters, and then Night Swan is the Moriarty to Thrawn's Sherlock. So there's this really interesting confrontation towards the end of Thrawn, the first book, where Night Swan confronts Thrawn and is like, hey, you're a super smart guy. Of all people, you should be able to know that the Empire is corrupt. And Thrawn has this interesting moment where he says, yes, I believe that it is corrupt and it is evil, but there are things out there that are far worse than the Empire. And in a galaxy as chaotic as it currently is, tyranny is the only way to really get through to people, and is the only way to really, I guess, create some type of stable government in, like, the current, like, state of things in the galaxy. And it's very interesting to see Thrawn's perspective, because he's not a villain. And, Rebels kind of portrays him in a strange light, because there are hints in these books of how Thrawn, he views death, or innocent death, as an unnecessary thing. He doesn't think that he only kills when he believes it's necessary, or when he's doing it to protect his people or his crew, or so on. He never does it out of spite or to be evil. And there are moments in Rebels where he does things that you can kind of be like, he just did that to be evil. Like in, I believe, episode 10 of season 3 of Rebels, he blows up one mechanic in the workshop and then goes, oh, let this be a demonstration or something, and just kind of basically murders a guy. But then you consider the fact that in that situation, the person who he killed was, in fact, sabotaging all of these pieces of equipment, and he killed one person to warn more people and to save more Imperial lives. So from his perspective, he's saving more lives at the cost of one. And that's kind of the way that Thrawn views things, and he's not an evil person. And there are weird moments in Rebels where he kind of loses his temper, like I believe in episode 6 or something of season 1, he loses his mind, or in season 3, sorry. He kind of gets really pissed off at this one guy for insulting a piece of art or something. Obviously in the finale of Rebels, he bombards Lothal. But in these books, you get to see kind of how this story leads into that. How, Thrawn's position in the Empire, where he's basically kind of discriminated against because he's like a blue alien from the unknown regions, and they view him as an outsider. And some people believe that, he doesn't deserve to be in the high ranks of the Empire, despite his tactical capability. And you get to see how Thrawn is just way better than most of these other people. And it's very interesting. It really delves into kind of the layers of corruption and everything in the Empire. Even with Governor Price, you get to see how kind of the Empire and the allure of power kind of corrupts her and turns her into this, psychotic, person that we see in Rebels, where she's just, completely incapable of logical thought. And in the first Thrawn book, a lot of it, I'd say, half the book is dedicated to her just as much as it is to Thrawn. And you get to see how they connect and all that, but you also get to see how Thrawn kind of doesn't let, kind of some of the tendencies of the Empire and the allure of power to corrupt him. He never really allows that kind of desire. He doesn't desire power. He never lets that allure, take control of him. And you see how Governor Price is the opposite in a way, and, she lets power just take her to these insane lengths. Like, they briefly allude to in Thrawn's first appearance in Rebels that the previous battle he was in, where he was promoted to Grand Admiral, the casualties of civilians outweighed the casualties of rebel insurgents, and you find out in the book that no, Thrawn had nothing to do with that. It was actually Governor Price who mercilessly killed, like, all of those people, and it's a really disturbing moment in the book. And, in a way, like, the first book in particular, I felt didn't really feel like a Star Wars book. Like, I really liked kind of how, I don't want to say casual, but how, like, deep in the Star Wars world it was, and how it didn't even really feel like the kind of grand scale Star Wars that we're used to. And I liked seeing the perspective of the Empire and, really inside and all the layers of corruption. You get to see that even in, the new Thrawn book, in the last book of this trilogy with Thrawn Treason, where, there's all these layers to it and all these different political parties. Like, you have Tarkin trying to take out Krennic and take, responsibility or take the credit for the Stardust Project, when we know in Rogue One that does eventually happen. And Krennic's kind of, an overconfident, crazy guy, but you do feel sympathy for him in a way because all these other people are trying to kick him out. And then you have Thrawn, who's in it just for the fact that he believes the TIE Defender is more advantageous for the Empire than the Death Star or Stardust Project. And then you even have this other character, Admiral Savitt, who is introduced, and he has the viewpoint that no matter what, the Death Star or Stardust will just fall flat. It will eventually fail them, and that someone will, be able to sabotage it, and eventually it'll be taken down, which we know to be true. So there's kind of that interesting perspective. It's like Thrawn doesn't entirely disagree with him, but he also has to kind of do certain things, or else, his people will be put in danger. He joins the Empire for, honorable reasons, because he wants to protect his people. But then I feel in doing so, he kind of puts himself in a position that he didn't really see. Thrawn, despite seeing everything the way that he does, kind of put himself in a position where, he's just kind of locked between these two different peoples. And you even get to see that kind of interestingly, like, those roles kind of swapped in Thrawn Treason, where Eli Vanto and Thrawn are kind of in similar positions. Eli is now working with the Chiss, and then they view him differently, and then the Empire views Thrawn differently, and they've kind of swapped roles, and it's rather interesting the way they tell the story through that. And then just kind of the brainwashing that the Empire does to you, like the character of Ronan, introduced in Thrawn Treason, kind of the underling of Krennic in a way, and they explore that in a very interesting way, how, the guy seems like kind of a snobby character like Krennic, but in the end he has a heart, and he ends up kind of having a redemptive moment and ends up kind of saving the day, or he saves Thrawn, actually. So, it's interesting to see all the layers of it, like how the Empire that we view as this big bad isn't fully evil. Like, there are all these different parties inside of the Empire that don't share the same views as the one person, as the Emperor, who views the Empire as just a way for him to gain power himself and to just be the most powerful person ever, basically, and to just be tyrannical and destroy worlds or whatever. You see that there are people that share different viewpoints. They don't all realize that they are just being corrupted by one individual. Everyone inside the Empire shares different viewpoints, and you get to see that interestingly. And then in Thrawn Alliances, you get a lot of interesting exploration of Thrawn and even Anakin and Darth Vader, which I wasn't expecting, because Darth Vader, we know him from the original movies. We know the story of Anakin from the prequels and the Clone Wars show, and we know the story of Vader. But what did we really see from Vader in between episodes 3 and 4? He appears in Rebels, fights a couple people. We don't see a lot of Vader. We don't see a lot of his internal conflict. And his story in Thrawn Alliances being told in a book format is able to elicit a lot of emotions, and you get to see inside Vader's head. And it's very interesting to see kind of these memories from the past, like switching between the past and the current storylines. You know, the plot that they set up in in Chaos Rising that I was talking about that they didn't explore. You see all of that in Thrawn Alliances, and in that book you got to see it from Thrawn's perspective in Chaos Rising, but in Alliances you get to see it from Anakin's perspective, and you know, you get to see inside Vader's head a lot. You get to see the past, and then kind of how Thrawn actually predicted the fall of the Jedi, and Anakin and Padme had an idea of the corruption that may have been inside the Republic all along, but they just didn't heed Thrawn's warnings. And when you have kind of moments in the past that Vader is reflecting on, you know, you get to see what he thinks of that, and kind of maybe the regrets he has, and the things that he's proud of, and the things that he maybe isn't quite as proud of. And you know, kind of these moments where Thrawn is able to kind of get a little bit of compassion out of Vader by reminding him of things from his past. And when Vader remembers his time as Anakin, he just refers to him as the Jedi. Whenever he refers to him, he separates himself from Anakin. He even tells Thrawn at the end of the book, Anakin Skywalker is dead. And then there's this really interesting moment where they have that conversation, and Thrawn very obviously knows Vader is Anakin, and he's like, I know, but I will never forget his legacy or something, because if one is remembered by a friend, one is never truly gone. There's just a lot of interesting elements there. That was easily my favorite part of Alliances, was the kind of introspection into Vader's character, and just kind of the deepening of the story of the prequels, and just the overall Star Wars narrative, how Anakin, before Order 66, before finding out Palpatine was the true Sith Lord, had this introspection and had an idea of what may be coming, but just didn't act on it. You even see that in Clone Wars with how the Jedi don't even act on the mystery being discovered about Darth Tyrannus and Count Dooku, because they don't want to have their opinion be swayed in the public eye. Stuff like that. Just very interesting. I always love stuff like that, where, you know, you have a different perspective on how they had ideas of what was going to happen, but they just didn't act on it, you know? And that one definitely felt more... Alliances felt more like kind of a fan-servicey book for Clone Wars fans and stuff like that, and it felt more like a Star Wars book than the other ones did. I feel Thrawn and Thrawn Treason feel far more detached than Thrawn Alliances, because with, like, you know, Thrawn Chaos Rising that I was talking about, the thing I liked about that book was that it was very hard focused on Thrawn, his people, the Chiss, and what's going on in the unknown regions, and doesn't really concern itself much with the overall Star Wars narrative. If you wanted a Thrawn story that does intertwine with the overall Star Wars narrative, then Alliances is what you want. That's the continuation of that story set up in Chaos Rising, and you get to see a lot of interesting elements at play in the past and the present, and I just really love this series. I think it's amazing. It's one of my favorite book series I've read in a while. I haven't been able to find a book series that's really been able to invest me as much as this one in a while, and I'm really looking forward to reading Greater Good. I ordered that one. That's the second of the Ascendancy Thrawn Trilogy. But yeah, this series really does change my view on Thrawn. I think in Rebels he is slightly inconsistent with his character here, because in this series Thrawn is a very, you know, understandable character. He takes risks. He sometimes gets close to, and on occasion does cross the line, but it's all for the good of everyone. He views it as the good of for the good of his people and for the good of the galaxy. But when you see him in Rebels, without having this introspection and kind of the view inside of Thrawn's head that you have here, and with that story being told once again from the perspective of the rebels against the Empire, you don't get to see how the Empire works and how it justifies itself and just the depth of the system. And this book series, in a way, does make me appreciate Rebels more, because that show feels very surface level, but when you read this, you get to see kind of the perspective and all these elements at play. There's even arcs for very minor characters and characters that don't even appear in Rebels. Eli Vanto, Commodore Pharaoh, a lot of characters. Like, I really love these characters. I really like them and enjoy them. Even small characters like, I believe there's like a stormtrooper commander. I forget his name, but there's a stormtrooper commander in the second book, and he has kind of a funny little story arc with Rook, who appears in Rebels, the weird, like, frog, reptile bounty hunter guy. Like, there's a whole bunch of kind of cool little elements, you know, just small characters that are memorable, and it's just a very enjoyable series. I think that, you know, if you're looking for like a Thrawn story that intertwines more with the overall Star Wars narrative, and, you know, if what you enjoy is the Skywalkers and the story of the Empire and the Rebels and stuff like that, I feel like you'll enjoy this more than the Ascendancy trilogy. I like the Ascendancy trilogy so far, like out of the first book and then the second one upcoming. What I enjoy about it is how detached it feels from the rest of the Star Wars narrative, despite feeling consistent with these books, having now read them. But yeah, I really enjoy this book series, and it's not just because, you know, there's fan servicey elements, because there are cool fan servicey elements in these books that I really enjoyed reading. But like, I seriously got invested in these books. Like, Thrawn Alliances towards the end of that book, I could not put it down. I was just like, I just read like 6 chapters in one night. I was so invested in it. Same thing with Treason. Treason started on a weaker note because I wasn't quite as invested, because, you know, Thrawn and Thrawn Alliances had those elements that invested me. The Chaos Rising book set up the plot that is explored in Thrawn Alliances, and I was excited to see that play out, and just seeing how Thrawn came in contact with the Empire and how he rose through the ranks was an interesting setup for the first Thrawn book. Treason didn't really have that kind of hook from the very beginning, but as the narrative began to play out, I found it very investing and very interesting, especially for, you know, even minor characters like director or assistant director Ronan. There's just a lot of interesting characters you don't know, just so much introspection. I didn't expect there to be so much, you know, development and exploration of characters like Vader. Like, I think this is probably some of the most interesting Vader stuff we've ever seen in Star Wars, and it's just, I just appreciated these books. I didn't expect to enjoy them as much as I did, but these are amazing books, and in a way they kind of, it's the same thing that I feel some people feel about Clone Wars, is that Clone Wars made the prequels better. I always liked the prequels, but I agree that Clone Wars does improve on aspects and does expand upon aspects that were kind of glossed over in the prequel films. And now we have a book series that, in a way, improves my opinion on a relatively mediocre TV show. So, I think that's a win, and I'm really looking forward to reading Thrawn Greater Good, the rest of them. I do view the Thrawn character in the Rebels show as a slight exaggeration and as a more villainous and antagonistic character, and I don't really think it's right that Dave Filoni should have first crack at what they do with Thrawn in the future. I feel like that right should be reserved for Timothy Zahn, and I'm now very concerned as to what Dave Filoni will do with Thrawn in the Ahsoka TV show if they turn him into a straight-up villain. It's just boring. Like, that's just a boring character. I just think that's extremely boring if they have him just be another antagonist. I think it would be really cool if they brought in characters from the book series that we haven't seen before into live action and into the shows, and you actually get to see the Chiss and the Chiss Ascendancy and stuff like that, Eli Vanto. But I somehow find that unlikely, and I feel like it'll be about Ahsoka, and Thrawn will just be kind of a villain, and he'll probably die at the end, and it'll probably be boring. And then Timothy Zahn will probably write more books to try and make them better, and he probably will, because, man, he's an amazing writer. But yeah, I really loved the Thrawn Canon Trilogy, Thrawn Alliances, and Thrawn Treason. I loved all 3 of these books. I'd say that Thrawn, the first one, is probably the strongest because of how it explores Thrawn's climbing through the ranks and just kind of his character, and even Governor Pryce as well. Just very interesting book. Alliances adds a lot to Vader's character, adds a lot to the story of the prequels and the originals, and then Treason just kind of leads into Rebels in an interesting way and kind of justifies some of Thrawn's actions in that show that I deem to be a little bit extreme. So you guys please let me know what you thought of my review of the Thrawn Canon Trilogy. Have you read it? Are you going to read it now that you've watched this video? Whatever your thoughts are, just please let me know them all in the comments below. And of course, as always, I hope you guys have a great day. Take care.